What I'm about to tell you, Chosen One, will completely change your perception of why certain people can't understand you and why a very powerful person wants you eliminated. An inquiry was conducted, not the type you read about in the press, but the kind that goes on behind closed doors and is financed by individuals whose identities are never included on official records. The kind in which a file including your picture and one command is sent to the investigator. Identify the weak point. Determine the leverage. Before they become unstoppable, figure out how to eliminate this menace. But this is something no one saw coming. Not to mention the investigator who took on this task, assuming it would be standard work. They were more aware that they weren't seeing into a person as they delved farther into your life. They were coming across a phenomena that defied all classifications, profiles, and techniques they had been taught. And what they found would compel them to make a decision that would affect not just your destiny, but also the destiny of everyone who, like you, dares to live at full potential in a society that is set up to keep people small. Business leaders who need information on whistleblowers. Politicians seeking to exert pressure on competitors. Rich households who need the discrediting of embarrassing relatives. It was always the same recipe. Everyone has something they would want to conceal if you dig deep enough. However, your file was unique from the start. Later on, both the customer and the investigator would discover that they had given remarkably comprehensive instructions, but they had never received the client's true name. This was not a search for personal scandals or financial anomalies. This has to do with something far more particular and more riskier. The existing systems are at danger because of this man. They operate outside the typical bounds of influence and control, according to the brief. Identify the places of psychological strain. Look for trauma that can be used as a weapon. Before they encourage others to overcome their indoctrination, figure out how to break them. The investigator had presumed that they were dealing with a whistleblower or activist who had discovered material that influential individuals wanted kept quiet. Financial records, connection patterns, digital traces, psychological vulnerabilities that might be exploited, and a standard inquiry were all things they planned for. They weren't prepared for the realization that your knowledge made you non-threatening. What you had turned into made you dangerous. Within hours after starting their job, the tempting Pensicator's first warning sign appeared. You had an almost flawless digital footprint. You seemed to live with a degree of purpose that left no unintentional traces, not because you were concealing anything. Every recorded conversation, financial transaction, and internet exchange revealed someone who made every decision with surgical accuracy and full understanding of the consequences. However, it wasn't the unsettling aspect. The unsettling aspect was that this accuracy seemed to go all the way back in time, even to times when you ought to have been too young or untrained to have such knowledge. Records of decisions you took that seemed paranoid at the time, but turned out to be prescient subsequently, were discovered by the investigator. Relationships you terminated that other people believed were stable only to see them go apart in precisely the manner you had subtly predicted. It seemed as if you had been using information that you shouldn't have had access to. Predict events that defied rational explanation, as if you could discern patterns that others couldn't. The investigator started to sense the beginnings of something they had never encountered in their career. Real discomfort. However, there is something far more unsettling hidden behind this superficial pattern. Your history was more than a collection of events, the investigator found. It was a book of spells. Every betrayal you had faced, every heartache that should have devastated you, every time when trust was broken beyond repair. These were more than simply unpleasant experiences. Every wound has been turned into a source of mystical enlightenment via initiations and ceremonies. The majority of individuals carry their past about like dead weight or scar tissue, which restricts their mobility and serves as a constant reminder of their weaknesses. However, the investigator was unable to classify or comprehend the alchemy you had accomplished. You had transformed every experience into a rune in a language that only you could decipher, a coded guide for overcoming obstacles in the future with accuracy that verged on the prophetic. Evidence of instances in which you actually sought advice from your suffering like an oracle was discovered by the investigator. You didn't go into victim mode or panic when confronted with fresh betrayals. Instead, by drawing on the wisdom that has been etched into your soul by past betrayals, you're able to handle the circumstance with the expertise of someone who has already completed this precise curriculum, although in a different outfit. The investigator's professional poise was shaken by this finding. They understood that they were not looking at a trauma survivor. Someone who had turned it into a weapon was under investigation. However, what would follow would turn that uneasiness into something that was almost terrifying. As the inquiry progressed, the investigator found something that went against all of the principles they had learned about human behavior and psychology. The majority of individuals have predictable life patterns. Trauma experienced as a child causes certain dysfunctions in adults. Career choices are correlated with educational background. Relationship patterns are determined by socioeconomic level. These trustworthy linkages had been the foundation of the investigator's profession. These regulations made your life chuckle. The researcher discovered evidence of trauma that seemed to have fostered spiritual independence rather than causing patterns of reliance. It seems as though you chose people based on criteria unrelated to common compatibility markers. Educational experiences that ought to have led to traditional career paths somehow produced knowledge and skills that were incomprehensible and relationships that defied every demographic prediction. The fact that you had turned desertion itself into sovereignty, however, was the most disturbing finding. Records of relationships that ended with you being rejected were discovered by the investigator. There have been times when someone you trusted just disappeared without warning or explanation. They anticipated discovering proof of injuries that never went away. Attachment styles that caused you to pursue people who had turned you down. Rather, they found something that broke all of their preconceived notions about psychology. Every desertion had turned into a commencement. Every time someone left you, you utilized that rejection as a springboard to create something even more useful rather than pursuing them, pleading with them, or attempting to show your value. Total emotional autonomy, a pattern that started with destruction and concluded with freedom, was identified by the investigator. Your spirit remained intact despite being abandoned. It dispelled your delusions about need approval from others in order to feel whole. To build an inner kingdom so comprehensive and self-sustaining that no one's absence could disturb its foundation, you had absorbed every rejection and turned it into raw material. Because you had learned to pick yourself so thoroughly that outside selection was no longer important, you had matured into someone who doesn't wait to be chosen, in contrast to others who could have acquired codependency or people-pleasing behaviors. The investigator came to the realization that they were examining a person who had converted exile into empire and used every setback as fuel to create a life with completely different norms. The finding that your reactions to crisis circumstances displayed a pattern the investigator had never seen was even more unsettling. You appear to function from a position of calm assurance, even in the middle of turmoil, while most people respond emotionally and then reason afterward. Where people base their choices on want or fear, your decisions seem to be the result of a deeper intellect that took into account factors the investigator was unable to even pinpoint. The customer had requested pressure points for psychological reasons. The researcher was starting to suspect that they could be working with a person who had beyond the psychological structures that enable pressure points. The true shock, however, was yet to come. Take a time to think about it. I have a very significant matter that requires your attention. Through this weekly Zoom call, we're sharing what we know about personal power, healing oneself, and healing others. No holding back. No filters. All of the esoteric secrets we have accumulated during actual years of spiritual practice have been subtly included. Those who are willing to follow the same route may now access the methods and knowledge that helped us go from controlled porn to conscious artists. Please accept this offer to become a member of Obsidian Inner Order and help us expand our platform so that we can reach more selected individuals who are awaiting activation. In addition to obtaining access to forbidden knowledge, joining the Obsidian Inner Order entails joining a movement that is rewriting reality itself. All of us benefit from it. The description contains a link. The investigator discovered a finding 3 weeks into the job that would follow them for the rest of their professional life. They discovered a trend that was inexplicable when tracking down your previous connections. Everybody who had attempted to dominate, manipulate, or betray you finally had to deal with unexpected repercussions. Something considerably more disturbing than retribution or revenge. Reality itself seems to be working in concert to keep everything in balance. Business associates who had defrauded you discovered that their own endeavors were inexplicably failing. Unfaithful romantic partners saw their new relationships disintegrating in ways that reflected their betrayal of you. Due to societal forces they were unable to comprehend or control, friends who had circulated untruths about you found themselves alone. The investigators searched for proof that you had planned these events for days. For networks of influence, they looked for evidence of manipulation and any sign that you were actively pursuing revenge. Rather, they discovered something that contradicted their conception of reality. You seem to live according to natural rules that most people are unaware of, as if your dedication to real relationships produced an energy field that drew real connection and inherently rejected dishonesty. As if circumstances were drawn into line with your greatest good by a gravitational force caused by your unwillingness to compromise your integrity. The investigator started to understand that they were not looking at someone who could be manipulated using traditional methods. They were looking into a person who has mastered manipulating forces that are beyond the realm of ordinary manipulation. What really shocked the investigator, however, was learning that your empathy, which the client had pointed out as a possible weakness, was really a result of facing your own shortcomings. You had entered such areas head-on and made peace with the local creatures, while others fled from their potential for devastation, their rage, and their ability for darkness. Everywhere the investigator looked, there was proof of this shadow integration. There have been instances when your capacity to think like a predator has enabled you to identify one before it had a chance to attack. Instances where you were shielded from manipulation, where warmer hearts would have been tempted by your ability to be strategically frigid. There have been instances when your readiness to be despised has prevented you from sacrificing your morals in order to gain social approval. It was not your light that had chosen you. The investigator became more alarmed upon realizing that you had been selected due to your mastery of darkness. Something the investigator had never seen before was produced by this blending of light and shade, because there were no aspects of themselves that they were attempting to conceal or deny. The creature could act with total honesty. In the most exquisite manner imaginable, you had become dangerous, safe for everyone, yet dangerous for those who would want to dominate, manipulate, or devalue you. Sufficiently sincere to come to you with good intentions. The client's fear of you was understood by the investigator. You had previously confronted and incorporated everything that control systems usually take advantage of. Thus, you represented someone who couldn't be controlled. The second set of instructions was then given to them. The customer had been keeping an eye on the investigation's development and was dissatisfied with the dearth of useful information. The new instruction was clear. Psychological pressure points were to be created if they could not be located. The investigator had the tools to set up situations that might jeopardize your safety or reputation, create controversies, or fake evidence. At this point, the investigator became aware of the actual purpose of their work. They had no criminal or national security danger under investigation. They were aiming for someone whose mere presence challenges power structures that rely on maintaining people's dependence, predictability, and control. For certain forces in the world, you stood for something wholly undesirable. A person who has attained true independence. The true freedom that arises when someone has put in the inner effort required to become unshakable, unmanipulable, and uncompromisingly authentic. Not the false sense of freedom that comes from riches or rank. Something changed within the investigators as they gazed at the updated instructions. For the first time in their professional lives, they started to doubt not just their task, but the system they had dedicated their lives to. However, they were going to learn that challenging the system was only the first step. The investigator made a revelation that would completely alter their plans as they were ready to carry out the client's more demanding requests. You weren't absent while you were silent. Containment was the strategy. Your propensity for little communication was first seen by the investigator as a possible weakness, an indication of social awkwardness or emotional detachment that may be taken advantage of. Rather, they learned that your silence was a calculated decision, a kind of power so complex that most people were unable to identify it for what it was. The investigator was just starting to understand something that you understood. Not all truths must be revealed right away, and not all conflicts must be resolved verbally. You weren't silent for nothing. It was packed with realities that were too difficult for naive brains to absorb. Insights that, if ever made public at the wrong time, have the potential to shatter illusions and change the balance of power. Instances when others sought to press your buttons or drive you into response patterns, as well as interactions where others tried to provoke you, were discovered by the investigator. You had always been steady, perceptive, and inexplicably composed. You were playing a lengthier game than everybody else in the room, not because you didn't care. This degree of self-control comes from realizing the power of words. Every location you enter is impacted by that energy, and the capacity to maintain your sovereignty in the face of adversity is often a sign of great strength. The investigator came to the realization that they were dealing with someone who had mastered the art of silence, understands when to speak and when to keep quiet, and knows that certain facts are nuclear and need to be treated with the respect that such authority requires. The most horrifying insight, however, was that you were almost illegible to standard questioning methods because of your quiet. The client's tactics relied on evoking strong emotions in order to apply pressure that would compel errors or disclosures. When someone has mastered the art of finding their center in the midst of any storm, how can you put pressure on them? The investigator started to encounter something unexpected as they carried on with their job, now divided between their developing respect for their topic and their professional duty. The more they investigated your life, the more they had to face hitherto unexplored facets of their own lives. Their own fragility was brought to light by your tenacity. Your insight revealed their own naive perception of human potential. They were vividly conscious of how much they lived in response to the acceptance and expectations of others as a result of your sovereignty. Most troubling of all, your dedication to authenticity revealed the many ways they had sacrificed their own integrity in order to feel safe and accepted. The purpose of the study was to identify your flaws, but you had inadvertently made it a mirror reflecting the investigator's own untapped potential and buried scars. You had made it difficult to examine your life without also investigating what a fully empowered human existence may look like, all without a word or even realizing you were being scrutinized. If the investigator had had the guts to reject diminishment, the dedication to progress above comfort, and the fortitude to stand alone rather than sacrifice their core principles for acceptability, they would have been laying awake at night wondering what their life may have been like. At that point, they were aware that they had changed from hunter to student, investigator to apprentice, and someone who wanted to kill you to someone who was yearning to learn how you had accomplished what they now understood to be the rarest thing in the world. Whole, genuine power. However, the most significant finding was still to come. The investigation discovered something that went against every rule of probability and circumstance when they looked more closely at your life patterns. You don't follow fate. Rather, you had turned into a force that attracts fate to you. It was hard to ignore the overwhelming facts. Opportunities that appeared out of nowhere at just the right times when you needed them most. Relationships with just the right individuals at precisely the appropriate moments. Resources that appeared at the precise moment your vision called for them. Barriers that, as you got closer, vanished or changed into stepping stones. For weeks, the investigators searched for signs of strategic planning, networking, or manipulation that might account for these trends. Rather, they learned something that contradicted their conception of reality. You had discovered a way to bring your inner reality and your innermost purpose into such perfect harmony that everything started to fall into place around that alignment. This was no accident or stroke of luck. The world seemed to work in their favor because this person had come to embody such clarity about their route and purpose. In addition to rejecting circumstances that would detract from or divert you, you had turned into a living magnet for events that support your greatest progress. The investigator recognized that they were seeing someone who had learned to use reality as a partner in collaboration rather than as a foe to be defeated. Every decision you made appeared to have an impact that provided you just what you needed while instinctively weeding away anything that may hurt you. You are not only unstoppable, but also unmanageable at this degree of alignment. The investigator had already determined they could not proceed when the final instruction came one morning. The customer was now seeking concrete action after becoming irritated with delicate methods. They gave you detailed directions on how to set up a scenario that would permanently and publicly disgrace you. A time frame, tools, and connections to assist in organizing the required evidence were provided to the investigator. At this stage, however, the investigator realized something the client had not expected. You weren't just another object to destroy. You were evidence that the control, manipulation, and fear-based systems they supported were not only superfluous, but also deliberately detrimental to human potential. The investigator came to the realization that their decision will determine not just their professional path, but also their personal identity. They might finish the task, ruin someone whose sole transgression was attaining true freedom, and go on supporting the structures that keep people mired in cycles of fear and reliance. Or they could have the guts to say no, even if they know that doing so would probably mean the end of their career and potentially their safety. The investigator realized that you had done something far more hazardous than they had ever thought when they stood in their office with orders to destroy you. Not only had you gained personal independence, you had turned into a live example of how anybody who was prepared to put in the effort you had put in might achieve such independence. And that kind of protest was the biggest danger in a society where the majority of people are supposed to be predictable and under control. However, one more piece of information that completed the picture of why you were deemed so hazardous was discovered by the investigator. Secrets weren't being kept safe. The secret was you. You weren't keeping secrets. You were the knowledge that had been layered and coded so that only those who had earned the privilege could decipher it. Every facet of your life, every barrier you maintained, and every decision you made about who had access to what parts of your true self were all deliberate. Some individuals approach others only to take, as you had discovered. You had adjusted then. It was knowledge, not pain or terror, that had made you selective. People could not force you to tell your truth. They needed to demonstrate their worthiness of such trust, their patience, and their honesty in order to unlock it. The detective came to the realization that they had been attempting to decipher a person who was organized like a living code, a soul that only became visible to those who approached with earnest regard and gained comprehension. You were selective in all facets of your life. Your time, effort, and emotional commitment. Everything was distributed with the accuracy of someone who recognized the sacredness and limitedness of these resources. Because you had discovered by unpleasant experience that most people don't appreciate things they haven't earned, you didn't give yourself away easily. The investigator realized that this was the reason you posed such a hazard to control systems. Those who hadn't done the inside work to understand themselves couldn't read you. Thus, they couldn't control you. Because you functioned from a place of self-knowledge and self-possession that rendered outside pressure meaningless. You were almost immune to the psychological leverage that keeps most people controllable. However, something much more deep about the forces they were dealing with was revealed by the investigators' moment of choosing. They started to realize that your power worked on levels they had never imagined as they wrestled with their choice. Not only had you persevered through your hardships and come out stronger, most individuals never learned to operate with the natural rules that you had mastered. The investigator knew that any effort to hurt you would probably end badly. You had so fully connected yourself with actual power that reality itself seemed to defend you, not because you would strike back. The reason the individuals who attempted to deceive you faced repercussions was not because you wanted retribution, but rather because lying inherently breeds instability that finally crumbles under its own weight. You were dangerous because you had overcome the impulse to fight, not because you could defeat your adversaries. You were operating at a level of awareness that rendered traditional assaults moot. Efforts to weaken you simply served to emphasize how unbreakable you are. Attempts to subjugate you only serve to affirm your autonomy. Isolation tactics simply serve to highlight how fully you had developed inside yourself. Since you had previously endured all that might have shattered you and utilized those experiences to create something indestructible, the investigator realized that they had been recruited to destroy someone who couldn't be destroyed by traditional methods. The final report from the investigator was never submitted. Rather, they completely vanished from their line of work, leaving behind a career based on supporting institutions that they now recognize to be essentially corrupt. Some claim that they made an effort to alert you to the forces that are pursuing you. Others assume that by being silent, they have chosen to conceal your whereabouts and identity. Here's what counts, however. Selected 1. You symbolize something that cannot be contained, controlled, or destroyed by outside manipulation, which is why the inquiry failed. Not because the investigator was incompetent. You have attained what few people acquire, but which is the goal of every genuine spiritual system: total congruence between your external manifestation and your inner reality. People like you aren't threats because of what you do, and the powers who wanted you destroyed didn't realize that. Because of what you stand for, you pose a danger. You're a live example of how people can overcome limitations. Their authenticity need not be sacrificed for security. You don't have to be little to keep others from getting threatened. Every decision you make should respect your true authority. Every limit you establish to safeguard your energy. You are voting for a new sort of world every time you refuse to devalue yourself for the comfort of others. A society where individuals are reminded of their own strength, value, and ability to design lives that fulfill their greatest potential rather than their worst anxieties. The customer that hired the investigator will never comprehend what they discovered. Some individuals have already been broken and have chosen to rebuild themselves in their own way. Therefore, they cannot be broken. Some individuals are uncontrollable because they have learned to get their value from themselves rather than on approval from others. Some individuals have learned that their genuine strength comes from what they know to be true about themselves, not from what other people think of them. And as a result, they cannot be lessened. No inquiry will ever fully catch you because of that selected one. Why you will never be completely controlled by any system. And why people are still motivated to challenge the boundaries they have accepted in their own lives by your mere presence. Your mission is not the only thing you are doing. You are demonstrating that leading a life with a purpose is feasible despite a society that is set up to keep individuals preoccupied, reliant, and disengaged from their true potential. The most potent truth of all is revealed by the investigator's journey from hunter to guardian. Even individuals who have dedicated their lives to upholding control and manipulation systems may be awakened by the uncommon and inspirational encounter with someone who has really attained freedom. The forces that would weaken you are not hidden from you. Knowing that true strength produces its own defense, that true wisdom produces its own direction, and that true sovereignty draws precisely the experiences and connections that support your greatest development, while inherently rejecting everything that would jeopardize your integrity, you are walking boldly in your power. Instead of destroying you, the inquiry showed that you are the investigation. The question that makes people consider how they relate to authority, sincerity, and the bravery needed to live a life devoid of compromise. You are the example that demonstrates to others what may happen when someone persistently chooses development above comfort to the point where change is unavoidable, even if you are not the solution to anybody else's issues.